The late afternoon sun pressed down on the forward operating base like a smelter's furnace. Waves of heat rose off the cracked concrete, making even the steel roofs shimmer. Inside the command tent, the air was only marginally cooler, the overhead. Fans pushing around dust and the faint tongue of sweat. Commander Rachel Hayes stood at the center table, a woman carved from the demands of 17 years in the Navy. Her posture was military perfection, but there was an intensity in her eyes that no regulation could teach, a quiet calculation, a readiness to pounce when the moment came. On the table lay a satellite image in high resolution. Gray walls, angular rooftops, and an open courtyard stood out in the desert expanse. Beside it, a notepad was scribbled with numbers, angles, and wind direction symbols. The intel officer, a wiry man with sandy hair and a deep crease between his brows, pointed at the screen. 3 high-value targets, he said. Confirmed enemy generals. All meeting in this courtyard 48 hours from now. Once the meeting ends, they scatter to separate locations. We won't get another shot at them. Hayes studied the image. The compound sat like a stone fortress in a sea of sand, miles from the nearest settlement. Guard towers flanked each corner, their lines of sight overlapping like a lethal grid. She imagined the interior, guards with rifles, snipers on the rooftops, machine guns braced behind sandbags. "What's our strike option?" she asked, her voice even. The intel officer hesitated. "Airstrike is off the table. Too close. To civilian zones. Collateral risk is high." A low murmur of frustration rippled through the small circle of operators in the tent. "Direct assault?" Hayes pressed. "Not feasible," the intel man said, shaking his head. "Too much open ground. We'd be chewed apart before we breached the gates. The only viable option." He paused, almost as if bracing for impact. "Is long-range engagement." That caught the attention of Daniels, the team sniper, who was leaning casually against the wall, cleaning his rifle. Hayes glanced at him, then back at the intel officer. "Define long range," she said. The officer tapped the edge of the image, then drew a line with his pen to a distant ridge on the map. 1,782 yards. The number hung in the air like a challenge no one wanted to answer. From the far side of the tent, Petty Officer Cole let out a dry laugh. 1-7-8-2? You might as well tell us to hit a coin from here to the moon. Nobody makes that shot. Not first time, not in combat. Daniels, cleaning cloth, paused mid-swipe. He didn't say anything, but Hayes could see the flicker of intrigue in his eyes. "That distance isn't just skill," Cole went on, looking around at the others. "That's gambling against God." Hayes ignored him, her mind running the math. At that range, the bullet would take nearly 3 seconds to reach the target. Wind would push it. Heat shimmer could warp the sight picture, and even Earth's. Rotation, the Coriolis effect, would nudge it off course. 1 degree of error at the muzzle could mean a miss by several feet. The intel officer clicked a remote, bringing up dossiers. Black and white photos of the 3 generals filled the projection screen, hard-faced men with reputations soaked in blood. Under each picture were casualty estimates linked to their orders. Entire villages had been wiped out under their command. Convoys bombed, civilians executed in the streets. "These men," the intel officer said, "are the core of the enemy's leadership. Remove them, and their network collapses. Miss them, and—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Hayes' eyes locked on the middle photo. She remembered the aftermath of one of his orders. Charred homes, women clutching dead children, the acrid stench of burned flesh. She forced the memory away. "What about extraction?" she asked. "Chopper pickup 20 clicks east." The intel officer replied, "We'll have to move fast." Enemy QRF will be on us within minutes. Daniels finally spoke. I can make the shot. Cole scoffed, but Daniels didn't look his way. His gaze was fixed on Hayes, steady, confident. She studied him for a long moment. Daniels was good, one of the best, but this was something else entirely. If you miss, she began. I won't miss, he interrupted, his tone as flat as a rifle barrel. The tent fell silent. Hayes leaned over the map again, tracing the red line to the sniper perch. The ridge was exposed on 3 sides. A perfect firing angle, but a terrible place to get caught. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing into her spine. Finally, she straightened. No one can make that shot, she said. It wasn't sarcasm, it was truth. And yet, as she looked at the map, she knew exactly what was coming. In war, the line between impossible and necessary had a way of vanishing overnight. The briefing continued with tactical planning, but Hayes found herself only half listening. Her mind drifted to the wind charts she'd studied over the years, the unpredictable gusts that swept this region. She thought about how a bullet would rise and fall over nearly a mile of flight, how the sun's glare might refract through the scope at that hour. When the meeting ended, she stepped outside. The desert evening had started to cool, but the heat still clung to her skin. She removed her cap, letting the wind tug at her hair, and stared toward the faint blue outline of distant hills. Daniels joined her, cigarette already between his lips. He took a drag and exhaled slowly. You think it can't be done, he said, more statement than question. She gave him a sideways look. I think physics has rules for a reason. He smiled faintly. Rules are for people without the guts to break them. She didn't reply. He flicked the ash off the end of his cigarette and let the desert wind. Take it. You'll see, he said. If it comes down to me, they won't even hear the shot that kills them. Hayes looked back at the map in her mind. The line was long, almost impossibly so. Somewhere along that invisible stretch of air between the muzzle and the targets, there would be a moment where skill, luck, and physics all collided. She wasn't sure she believed in luck. Back in her quarters, she dropped onto her cot, still in uniform, boots caked in dust. She opened the mission file one last time, scanning the details until the black ink blurred. The photos of the generals stared back at her. They didn't look afraid. She closed the folder, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling. No one could make that shot. But in 2 days, someone would have to try. The next morning broke sharp and cloudless, the desert sky a relentless blue that offered no shade and no mercy. Inside the forward operating base, the tempo had shifted. Radios crackled more often. Vehicles rumbled in and out, and every operator seemed to walk with the quiet urgency of people who knew time was slipping through their fingers. Commander Rachel Hayes sat at the mission table again, this time with a steaming mug of bitter coffee in one hand and a folder thick with reconnaissance photos in the other. Across from her, the intel officer, Lieutenant Mark Tully, spread out the latest satellite captures on the table's worn surface. The images were grainy, but unmistakable. The compound from yesterday's briefing, viewed from different angles as the sun shifted across the sky. In one frame, 3 men in distinct, decorated uniforms were stepping out of separate vehicles. The time stamp was yesterday afternoon, but the pattern was clear. The generals were arriving at the compound in the same order every day, like clockwork. Hayes leaned forward, tracing the path from the main gate to the courtyard with the tip of her pen. They're comfortable, she said quietly. Too comfortable. Tully nodded. They think they're untouchable. Heavy guard rotations, rooftop coverage, and this. He tapped the rooftop of the central building. Thermal cloaks. They're prepared for drones. Cole, leaning against a supply crate, snorted. Prepared for drones, sure. But I bet they're not expecting someone to try threading a needle from a mile away. Hayes ignored him, focusing on the logistics. What's our window on meeting day? Tully glanced at his notes. They're inside the courtyard for no more than 10 minutes. They arrive separately, greet each other, stand for formalities, then head inside for the real discussions. If we're not in position and locked in before the first one arrives, we're done. Daniels, the sniper, was seated in the corner with a small notebook open, running numbers in pencil. He didn't look up as he spoke. 10 minutes is plenty if we're already glassing the target. But he flipped a page, sketching a rough wind rose. Those crosswinds are going to be hell. You could fire the same shot 3 times in a row and have 3 different points of impact. Hayes knew he was right. This part of the desert was infamous for unpredictable gusts, invisible until they carried dust just enough to glint in the light. That meant the spotter would have to be perfect, calling corrections in real time. Tully's voice hardened. If they survive this meeting, our intel suggests they'll approve a coordinated offensive along the eastern front. We're talking thousands of enemy fighters moving in synchronized assaults. Our forces will be outnumbered 3-1 in the first wave. Casualty estimates. He hesitated, then slid a sheet of paper across the table. The numbers were ugly. Too ugly. Hayes read them, her jaw tightening. These weren't just numbers. They were the faces of soldiers, engineers, medics, people she'd trained, fought beside, and sent home in flag-draped coffins. The weight of the moment settled over her shoulders like lead. This wasn't just another op. This was the kind of mission that would define or end careers. Cole broke the silence. We could just feed the coordinates to an allied drone strike. Tully shook his head. Already considered. Collateral damage risk is off the charts. Civilians in the surrounding area, workers, traders, families, they'd all be in the blast radius. This has to be surgical. Hayes spoke without looking up. And surgical means 1 bullet per head. No more, no less. Daniels finally looked up from his notebook, meeting her eyes. 3 heads, 3 bullets. The unspoken if you can lingered in the air. Hayes pushed the satellite images back toward Tully. What's our ingress? Tully pointed to a dry riverbed on the map. We insert here under cover of darkness, move 6 clicks on foot to the observation ridge. From there, you'll have the cleanest line of sight to the courtyard. Downside is, he traced a circle around the ridge. It's exposed from 3 sides. If they spot us, there's nowhere to hide. Extraction? Rendezvous point 20 clicks east. Humvee convoy. But Tully hesitated. If the generals are hit, the compound will lock down in seconds. Expect pursuit. Cole muttered. So basically, we shoot, run like hell, and hope we're faster than bullets. Pretty much, Tully replied. The operators chuckled grimly. But Hayes didn't smile. She was already mentally walking the path from insertion to the firing position, counting every possible snag, shifting dunes, enemy patrols, the risk of a compromised comms link. Later that afternoon, she stood on the observation deck of the base's highest guard tower, binoculars pressed to her eyes. The desert stretched endless and cruel in every direction. Out there, somewhere beyond the wavering heat lines, was a ridge she'd never seen in person, but already knew she would soon be lying on, heartbeat slow, finger on a trigger. Daniels joined her, his own binoculars scanning the horizon. I've made long shots before, he said, almost casually. She lowered her binoculars and glanced at him. Not like this. He smirked. Not like this, he agreed. But long enough to know distance is just math. The bullet doesn't care how far it has to go. You do the math right, it gets there. She raised an eyebrow. And if the wind changes in the middle of your math, then we do it faster. It was bravado, sure, but there was something in his tone, an unshakable steadiness, that made her wonder if he actually believed it. By nightfall, the plan was locked. Recon patrols were already charting safe passage points, and the quartermaster was stripping weapons to find the best parts for the mission rifle. Daniels spent hours poring over ballistics tables, wind drift charts, and elevation adjustments, while Hayes reviewed every contingency she could imagine. Still, when she finally lay down in her quarters, the numbers wouldn't leave her mind. 1,782 yards. 10 minutes to make the kills. A window so narrow, so fragile, that even the desert's breath could close it forever. She stared into the dark and thought of the generals, men who believed themselves untouchable, safe behind walls and soldiers. In 48 hours, they'd learn otherwise. The dim glow of the operations room cast long shadows over the scattered maps and gear sprawled across the table. Commander Rachel Hayes sat motionless, her eyes locked on the glowing projection of the enemy compound that dominated the wall before her. 3 red dots marked the positions of the enemy generals, their planned meeting point, and the mission's impossible objective. At 1,782 yards, the distance between her and those men felt less like a line and more like a chasm. The SEAL commander overseeing the operation had voiced the skepticism shared by many in the room. No one could make that shot. The words echoed in her mind, fueling a quiet fire. Hayes's mind ran through every factor that could derail the shot. The desert air, dry and sharp, could carry or dissipate the bullet's path. Wind gusts shifted unpredictably. The humidity and temperature altered the bullet's speed. Even the Earth's rotation, subtle but relentless, would tug at her aim. She had to account for every variable, every tiny detail. Beside her, Sergeant Reeves, her trusted spotter and the voice of reason, traced the terrain with a laser pointer. "The ridge here," he said softly, "offers a clear line of sight. It's exposed, yes, but it's our only vantage point for that range." She nodded, tapping a finger against the map. "We'll need to get there undetected. Timing will be everything. The meeting is set for 0430 hours. We have less than 4 hours to position ourselves." The team was already assembling their equipment with near-religious precision. Rifles were checked and rechecked. Ammunition was measured down to the grain weight, the slightest variation causing a miss at this distance. Ballistic calculators hummed softly, running countless simulations. Hayes ran her hands over the cold metal of her rifle. The barrel gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a work of engineering and deadly precision. She had spent weeks preparing for this, adjusting her breathing, honing her trigger control, learning the ins and outs of this particular weapon. Hours stretched into the night as she practiced shots on the range, pushing the limits of her rifle's accuracy. Each bullet whistled through the air, leaving trails of hope and doubt. She knew the mission's success depended not only on skill, but on perfect timing, nerves of steel, and a bit of luck. Her thoughts drifted to the generals. Below, men who had orchestrated brutal campaigns and bloodshed. Their deaths would ripple through the enemy ranks, halting offensives and saving countless lives. The weight of that responsibility pressed on her, heavy as the rifle she carried. Later, alone in her quarters, Hayes lay on the floor with her rifle across her chest, eyes closed. She ran the mission through her mind again, the approach, the calculations, the perfect shot. In the darkness, she heard the SEAL commander's words again, sharper this time. No one could make that shot. She clenched her fists. She would prove them wrong. The following hours were a blur of preparation, final checks, and whispered instructions. When the time came, Hayes and Reeves slipped silently into the desert night, moving with practiced grace toward the ridge. Each step was measured, each breath controlled. The desert was alive with danger, not only the enemy but the unforgiving terrain itself. Loose rocks shifted beneath their weight, the cold sand bit into their skin. Yet they pressed on, driven by a purpose that eclipsed fear. When they reached their perch, Hayes settled behind her rifle, adjusting her scope to the dim outlines of the compound below. The air was still, the only sounds the distant calls of night creatures and the faint hum of enemy radios. She felt Reeves beside her, steady and calm, a steady hand on the shoulder that grounded her. Together, they waited. As the clock ticked toward 0430, the generals appeared on the balcony, unaware that their fate was sealed by a sniper nearly 2,000 yards away. Hayes took a deep breath, steadied her hands, and prepared to defy all doubt. The impossible shot was within reach. The base workshop smelled of machine oil, solvent, and the faint metallic tang of freshly filed steel. A single hanging bulb swayed gently in the draft from the ventilation fan, casting a pale circle of light on the workbench. Tools were laid, out with surgical precision, torque wrenches, cleaning rods, precision gauges, and an assortment of scope mounts that glinted under the lamp. Commander Rachel Hayes stood beside Daniels, watching as he methodically stripped the team's two best rifles down to their skeletons. Both were tried and true M201, enhanced sniper rifles, but neither was perfect. At 1,782 yards, perfect wasn't optional. "We're making one gun out of two," Daniels said, his voice low but sure. "Best barrel from this one, best bolt from that one. Smoothest trigger group, tightest chamber tolerances. Every piece needs to feel like it was born for this shot." Hayes nodded, resisting the urge to hover. She knew enough about marksmanship to understand that at this distance, tiny imperfections became fatal flaws. A trigger that broke at 5 pounds instead of 4.5. A scope mount with the slightest flex under recoil. A bullet seated in the casing 2,007-inch too shallow. Reeves, her spotter for the mission, sat nearby at a folding table, scribbling calculations in a spiral notebook. Wind drift corrections, range tables, bullet drop at varying elevations. Page after page of handwritten numbers, the kind that would mean life or death when they were lying on that ridge. Daniels glanced up. "Ammo?" Reeves flipped open a green metal canister and set it on the bench. Inside were rows of shiny .300 Winchester Magnum cartridges, each one checked for weight consistency down to 1/10 of a grain. "These are all match grade," Reeves said, but I still weighed and measured them. "The 3 you'll fire are marked." Daniels inspected one, turning it between his fingers like a jeweler studying a diamond. He nodded once, approving. Hayes leaned over the workbench, watching as Daniels reassembled the rifle. The barrel slid into place with a kind of snug fit. That felt inevitable, like two puzzle pieces finally meeting. The bolt was polished smooth enough to catch the light. The trigger group clicked into place, the pins flush against the receiver. When he was done, the rifle didn't just look ready. It looked predatory. A long, matte black silhouette with a 5-25x scope mounted low over the receiver, sunshade attached to cut glare. The bipod was compact, sturdy, and silent. Daniels stepped back. "She's ready. Now we get you ready." Hayes frowned. "I'm not." "Yes, you are." Daniels interrupted. "You're taking the shot if I'm down, or if we need a second shooter. At that range, we can't waste time swapping shooters if something happens. You're gonna know this rifle like it's part of your arm." It wasn't a suggestion. The next hours blurred into a steady rhythm. Load, aim, dry fire. Cycle the sequel. Bolt, load again. Hayes lay prone on the workshop floor, the rifle stock pressed into her shoulder, cheek welded to the comb, eyes locked through the scope. Daniels stood over her, watching her breathing, adjusting her grip, shifting her elbows by millimeters. "Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast," he said each time she hesitated. "The rifle doesn't care about your heartbeat, but the bullet will. Control the heartbeat. Control the shot." Reeves called imaginary wind corrections from the side. Half value left to right, 2.7 mils. Adjust, hold, break. Over and over, until her muscles began to memorize the positions without thinking. The sound of the trigger breaking in dry fire was crisp, clean, a small mechanical whisper in the quiet room. By the third hour, Hayes could settle in behind the rifle and feel it align without conscious effort. She no longer needed to think about hand placement or the way the bipod's feet bit into the floor. She simply was the rifle. It was after midnight when Daniels finally called it. "Good enough for tonight. Get some rest." She almost laughed at the suggestion. Rest felt like a luxury no one could afford. But her body was starting to feel the hours. Shoulders aching, eyes dry from staring down the scope. She nodded, stood, and stretched. As she turned to leave, Reeves cleared his throat. "Storm's coming in faster than we thought." Hayes stopped. "How bad?" Reeves flipped. Opened his notebook, showing her the latest weather readings. "Sandstorm, heavy. Visibility will drop to less than 50 feet. If we wait until it passes, we lose the window. Only shot is before it hits." That meant they had less than 24 hours. The realization landed like a stone in her chest. She looked at the rifle on the bench, black and still, as if it were already asleep and waiting to wake. "Then we move tonight." Daniels gave a single nod. Reeves began erasing and rewriting his numbers at twice the speed. By morning, they'd be crawling toward a position where one mistake would mean death. But for now, the rifle gleamed in the lamplight, silent, patient, ready. The desert at night felt alive in a way that daylight never revealed. Every sound carried in the stillness, the whisper of sand shifting under boots, the dry crackle of scrub brushed by wind, the distant hum of a generator somewhere beyond the horizon. Commander Rachel Hayes lay flat against the cold sand, the rifle cradled across her forearms. The night vision goggles painted the world in pale green, where every rock looked sharper, every shadow deeper. Beside her, Reeves scanned ahead with his monocular, marking the next patch of ground with a slight nod. They moved in silence, elbows and knees pushing them forward inches at a time. The bipod legs scraped faintly against the sand, and Hayes froze each time, waiting to be sure the sound didn't carry. The wind was low, too low for comfort. Low wind meant their noise traveled farther. 2 minutes to the next rock outcrop, Reeves whispered, voice barely a breath. Hayes nodded once. She could feel the weight of the mission pressing down with every yard they closed. They had 1,782 yards to cover in total firing distance. But the hard part wasn't pulling the trigger. It was getting to the point where they could. The ridge they'd chosen was high, narrow, and gave them just enough elevation to see over the enemy compound's outer wall. But to reach it, they had to cross nearly 200 yards of open ground under the faint glow of a half-moon. Any movement spotted by a guard, any shimmer in their optics, and the mission was dead. Reeves moved first. He slid forward like water over stone, his body low, hips and knees absorbing each shift in terrain. Hayes followed, rifle dragging lightly. Behind, careful not to let the barrel nose into the sand. Her gloves were already gritty with dust, but she didn't dare stop to wipe them clean. Halfway across the open stretch, she caught the faint silhouette of a guard pacing the outer wall. She froze, counting the man's steps. Reeves stopped too, melting into the shallow depression they'd found. The guard turned, heading back toward the compound's far side. Reeves touched her arm once, the signal to move. They reached the outcrop without incident, pressing themselves into the cool shadow of the rock. Hayes took a slow sip from the hydration tube, clipped to her plate carrier. Her pulse was steady, but her breathing felt just a shade too quick. She forced herself to slow it, inhaling for 4 counts, holding for 4, exhaling for 4. The climb to the ridge began here. The slope wasn't steep, but it was covered in loose shale that threatened to betray them with every step. Reeves went first again, choosing footholds carefully, each placement deliberate. Hayes followed, pausing whenever a small stone skittered. Away. The sound of even one rolling pebble seemed loud enough to wake the desert. It took 15 minutes to crawl just 30 feet. At the top, the world opened. The compound lay below, lit by the dull orange wash of sodium lamps. Hayes could see the flat-roofed main building, a radio tower, and 2 small barracks. She also saw the small cluster of armed men in the courtyard, unaware that death was crawling toward them. Reeves flattened himself behind a cluster of rocks and scanned with his binocular. "There," he murmured, "south balcony. That's where the generals will be meeting." Hayes followed his line of sight. The balcony was small, with a waist-high wall, just enough space for a few chairs and a table. A perfect target zone if she could get the angle. They needed to be in position before the first hint of dawn lightened the sky. The generals' meeting was scheduled for precisely 0430. It was 0338 now. The last 30 yards felt like moving through water. Every muscle screamed to go faster, but she forced herself to keep the pace steady, deliberate. Rushing now would undo everything. When they finally reached their chosen perch, Reeves and Hayes lay belly down behind the ridge's crest. The rifle slid forward onto its bipod, the legs locking into grooves Reeves had quietly carved in the rock during their recon 2 nights before. Hayes scanned the compound through her scope, the mil-dot reticle crisp in her sight picture. She found the balcony instantly. Reeves was already unfolding the small weather kit, measuring wind speed, temperature, and humidity. He whispered numbers, barely audible, but Hayes caught every one. Wind 1.6, half value from the left, humidity 32%, temperature 64. Her hands moved without thinking, making the micro-adjustments on the scope's turrets. She double-checked the rangefinder reading, 1,782 yards exactly, and then they waited. The stillness pressed in. The sound of her own breathing seemed too loud, so she slowed it further. Somewhere in the compound, a dog barked twice and went silent. At 0427 movement, 3 figures emerged from the building onto the balcony. The body language was unmistakable, the relaxed confidence of men used to power. 2 wore dark uniforms with peaked caps. The third was in a plain jacket, but his presence commanded the others' attention. Reeves confirmed their identities. With a single glance, Hayes adjusted the magnification, the generals' faces sharpening in her scope. She could see the steam rising from their coffee mugs. "Targets acquired," she murmured. Reeves leaned in, his voice a thread of sound. "On my call." Her finger rested against the trigger, pressure light but ready. The reticle hovered on the center mass of the first general's forehead. At this distance, the bullet's flight. Time would be over 2.5 seconds, long enough for wind, temperature, and the Earth's own rotation to play their games. She exhaled, steady. 3, 2, 1. Rachel Hayes lay flat against the rocky ridge, her cheek pressed into the rifle stock, the cool metal grounding her in the chaos of the night. The air smelled of dust, hot metal, and faint traces of diesel from the compound below. Through the high-powered scope, the enemy generals looked impossibly far, 3 silhouettes, framed by the flicker of lantern light in a courtyard guarded by dozens of armed men. The rangefinder had already given the cold truth. 1,782 yards. That wasn't just long, It was absurd. Even for a career sniper, the shot was at the very edge of possibility. For Hayes, who had only been in the role for days, it was a leap across a canyon with no safety net. Beside her, Corporal Mason, her injured spotter, kept his voice low but steady. Winds shifting 2 clicks east. Mirage is heavy. You'll need a half-mil hold high and right. She adjusted the scope turrets carefully, the clicks echoing in her ears louder than they should. Her heart thudded in her chest, threatening to disturb her breathing rhythm. She remembered Mason's earlier words. The bullet doesn't care about nerves. Only math. The courtyard below was alive with movement. Guards moved along the perimeter, shadows overlapping under the glow of bare bulb lights strung between cracked walls. The 3 generals stood in a loose triangle near a wooden table, deep in conversation. Hayes could see the sheen of sweat on one man's temple, even from here. Every detail mattered. The way they shifted their weight, the angle of their heads, even the flickering light that might conceal her shot for half a second. She had maybe 2 seconds between her first trigger pull and the moment the others would react, if she was lucky. A faint gust brushed her cheek. Mason's voice was a whisper. Hold, wait for the lull. Her finger rested on the trigger. Gentle pressure building, but not breaking. Her breathing slowed, her world narrowing to the small circle of glass before her. The compound seemed almost frozen until a sentry walked into her line of sight. She let out the breath she'd been holding and waited. The sentry passed. Clear, Mason murmured. On you. Hayes exhaled slowly, letting her pulse settle. She counted heartbeats 1, 2, 3, then squeezed. The rifle barked with a sharp crack that rolled across the hills. Through the scope, she watched the first general jerk backward, a crimson mist looming in the lantern light. His body collapsed against the table, knocking over a tin cup. Before the shouts started, she adjusted quarter turn down, fraction right. The second shot came almost on instinct. The second general's knees buckled before he even reached for his pistol. The third general was turning, shouting orders, his face twisting in alarm. Hayes had to adjust for his sudden movement, the scope dancing for a heartbeat. She steadied, fired again. The third man crumpled, head snapping back violently. The entire courtyard exploded into chaos. Guards scrambled, weapons firing wildly into the darkness, muzzle flashes strobing like lightning in a storm. Bullets whipped over Hayes's position, snapping and hissing through the air. Mason tapped her shoulder sharply. Time to move. They slid backward down the ridge, staying low as rounds chewed into the dirt around them. Hayes felt the adrenaline flood her system. Every sound amplified, the crunch of gravel under her elbows, the metallic clink of spent casings, the distant echo of shouting in a language she barely understood. They moved like shadows, every step calculated. Behind them, the compound was a hive of panic. Spotlights cut across the hills, sweeping dangerously close to their position. Halfway down the slope, a flare burst overhead, bathing the terrain in ghostly white light. Hayes froze, pressing into the ground, heart hammering. She could feel Mason's breath beside her, shallow but controlled. The light faded, and they moved again, faster now. In her mind, the shots replayed over and over, the moment of stillness before the first trigger pull, the impossible distances collapsing into clean, perfect strikes. But she knew this wasn't over. The generals were down, but the enemies. Rage would burn hotter now. By the time they reached the base of the hill, the sandstorm that had been creeping across the horizon was finally arriving, swallowing the stars in a wall of grit. Mason grinned through the dirt. Looks like the desert's on our side tonight. Hayes allowed herself a thin smile, but her eyes stayed sharp. They still had to make it back through the shifting, blinding haze, and the enemy wouldn't stop hunting them just because the wind was screaming. And somewhere deep inside, she knew this night would follow her for the rest of her life. The sandstorm hit like a living thing. One moment, Rachel Hayes and Corporal Mason were slipping through the shadows at the base of the ridge. The next, the desert swallowed them whole. Sand clawed at their skin, whipped their clothes, and stung their eyes through every crack in their goggles. The wind howled in their ears, drowning out even their own breath. Hayes gripped her rifle close, head bent forward as she pushed through the shifting wall of grit. The desert floor seemed to vanish. Beneath her boots, the ground turning fluid under the storm's fury. Mason was a shadow just ahead, barely visible between the sheets of sand that ripped across their path. Every step was guesswork. Without the stars or moon, their sense of direction was gone. Mason checked his wrist compass under his jackets. Flap, shielding it from the wind, then jabbed his hand left, a signal to change course. They had to skirt a dry riverbed. It was now nothing more than a swirling pit of darkness. Somewhere behind them, the compound's alarm still screamed, faintly, carried in jagged pieces by the storm. Hayes imagined the enemy's search teams stumbling through the same madness, their lights swallowed by the desert's rage. She leaned close to Mason's ear, shouting over the gale. "They'll use night vision. Not in this." Mason shouted back, "And VGs will just light up with sand glare. They'll be blind." Blind, that was a comfort and a curse. The same storm hiding them was also hiding the cliffs, gullies, and drop-offs that could kill them faster than a bullet. They pushed on, muscles burning. The storm coated their clothes and weapons in fine, gritty powder. Every movement felt heavier. Hayes could feel the sand grinding between her teeth, even when she tried not to breathe through her mouth. A sudden blast of wind nearly knocked her sideways. Mason grabbed her shoulder, steadying her, and pointed ahead. Through the swirling haze, a darker shape loomed, an outcropping of rock rising from the sand like a shipwreck in the sea. They scrambled toward it, boots slipping, until the rock's jagged face blocked some of the wind. Crouching in its shadow, Hayes wiped her goggles, though the reprieve was brief before the grit coated them again. Mason leaned close. "We can wait here a minute. Let the worst of it pass." Hayes nodded, though her instincts screamed to keep moving. Every moment they stayed still was a moment the enemy might close in. But she knew Mason's leg wound, still sluggishly bleeding through the field dressing, needed the break. From their small shelter, Hayes could barely see more than a few feet, the storm turning the world into a grainy blur. She thought about the shots she had taken, the way each man had dropped. The memory brought a strange calm, mixed with annoying unease. She had done what needed to be done, but it wasn't over. Mason adjusted the strap of his pack. "Extraction. Point is still 3 clicks west. We move as soon as this wind drops a notch." 3 clicks in this is going to feel like 30, Hayes said. He gave a dry grin. "Good thing you're not afraid of long shots." They stayed low for another few minutes, until the roar of the wind shifted just slightly, a subtle change, but enough for Mason to jerk his chin toward the open desert. They moved again, hugging the rock formations where they could. The storm began to thin, just enough for them to make out faint shapes ahead, more ridges, more jagged teeth of stone. And then movement. Hayes froze. Through the grit, she spotted 2 figures stumbling across their path, rifles slung low. Enemy scouts, silhouettes blurred by the storm. Mason motioned for her to take the lead. They crouched low, circling wide, every step a gamble between stealth and speed. The wind's howl masked their movement, but the shifting sand betrayed them underfoot. One of the scouts turned sharply, raising his weapon. Hayes didn't hesitate. Her suppressed rifle coughed twice, each shot punching through the storm. Both figures dropped without a sound, swallowed by the desert floor. They didn't stop to check. Every second now was borrowed time. An hour later, though it felt like a lifetime, They reached the base of the final ridge before the extraction point. The storm had eased to a steady hiss, the wind still sharp but no longer blinding. From the ridge's crest, they could see the faint glow of headlights in the distance, a single vehicle waiting on a dirt road. Their relief was short-lived. From behind, the rattle of distant gunfire tore through the wind. Search teams had found their trail. Mason's voice was tight. Run. They sprinted, lungs burning, sand sliding underfoot. Bullets snapped past, some finding sparks on the rock. Hayes ducked, weaving, until they slid down the final slope toward the road. The vehicle's engine roared to life as they approached. A bearded driver in desert fatigues leaned out the window. Get in! They piled into the back, the tailgate. Slamming shut, the truck lurched forward, wheels spitting sand. Through the storm's fading veil, Hayes could see dark shapes chasing them along the ridge. Muzzle flashes flickered, but the truck was already pulling away, swallowed by the night. Hayes leaned back against the rattling metal, chest heaving, her hands still wrapped around the rifle like a lifeline. Mason gave her a nod, half approval, half exhaustion. You made the shot, he said simply. She didn't answer. The shot was only the beginning. The desert night had turned against them. The sandstorm came sudden and brutal, like an invisible wave crashing over Rachel Hayes and Corporal Mason. One moment, they were crawling through shadows at the base of the ridge. The next, the world around them dissolved into a choking tempest of grit and wind. The howling gusts tore at their gear and ripped away any sense of direction, turning the ground beneath their boots into a treacherous, shifting sea of sand. Hayes pressed her face into the rifle stock, grit stinging her eyes behind her goggles. The fine dust slipped into every crevice, lungs, ears, gloves, but she kept moving, muscles burning with every cautious step. Mason was just ahead, a ghostly figure navigating the storm by instinct and compass, shouting faint directions. Over the roar. 3 clicks west, Mason yelled, shielding his compass with a jacket flap. His voice was nearly lost to the howling wind. We've got to make the extraction point before dawn. The desert had become an unforgiving adversary. Without moon or stars, every step was guesswork. Hayes tried to focus on the dull thump of her boots against the sand, but the storm swallowed it whole. Her body screamed for rest, but adrenaline and training pushed her onward. Behind them, the distant howls of alarms from the compound barely pierced the storm's fury. Somewhere out there, enemy search teams stumbled blindly, their flashlights useless in the sand and wind. For a brief moment, that knowledge offered comfort. The storm was their shield, a wall of chaos that hid their escape. But the desert could just as easily be their grave. A sudden gust caught Hayes off guard, nearly knocking her sideways. Mason's hand shot out, gripping her shoulder and steadying her. Ahead, a dark silhouette emerged through the swirling sand, a jagged rock outcropping, their only refuge from the storm's wrath. They scrambled toward it, boots slipping on loose gravel. When they finally reached the shadowed rock face, Hayes dropped to one knee and wiped sand from her goggles with a gloved hand. The sandstorm roared around them, blurring the world to a dizzying haze. Mason crouched beside her, his voice a raspy whisper. We wait here. Let the worst of it pass. Hayes wanted to argue. Every second spent motionless was a second closer to the enemy. But she could see the exhaustion etched on Mason's face, the lingering pain from his leg wound, the raw fatigue beneath his calm exterior. They needed this pause. The minutes stretched, the storm battering their shelter like a relentless drum. Sand coated their clothes and weapons, grinding into every crevice. Hayes could taste the grit with every breath. The world outside was a blur of shifting shapes and sound, a wild, untamed force that seemed intent on swallowing them whole. Finally, the wind lessened, the roar dropping to a low hiss. Mason checked his watch, then gave a brief nod. "Move," he said. They slipped back into the night, moving low and fast, pressing close to the rock formations where they could find cover. The storm had cleared just enough for shadows to stretch, but visibility was still near zero. Every step was perilous, the desert floor riddled with unseen crevices, sharp rocks, and sudden drops that could end their mission and their lives in an instant. Suddenly, through the haze, movement flickered ahead. Two figures staggered across. Their path, rifles slung low, silhouettes blurred by sand and darkness. Enemy scouts. Hayes froze, heart pounding. Mason signaled for silence and motioned for her to take the lead. They circled wide, low, and careful, but the crunch of sand beneath their feet betrayed them. One scout spun, weapon raised. Hayes didn't hesitate. Her suppressed rifle barked twice. Two sharp cracks swallowed by the storm. Both scouts crumpled silently to the ground. No time to check bodies. The enemy would be onto them soon. Adrenaline surged as they pushed onward, every sense on edge. The storm was fading, but still whipped grit into their faces and clogged their breathing. Hayes' legs burned with exhaustion, but she pressed forward. After what felt like hours, they reached the base of the final ridge before the extraction point. The storm had thinned to a cold wind, slicing through their clothes, but no longer blinding. From the crest, faint lights flickered. A lone vehicle waiting on a dirt road. Relief was brief. Gunfire erupted behind them, tracer rounds and muzzle. Flashes cutting through the night. Search teams. Mason's voice was urgent. "Run!" They sprinted, lungs burning, sand slipping beneath their feet. Bullets whipped past, kicking up dust and rock fragments. Hayes ducked behind a low ridge, heart hammering, before leaping toward the road. The vehicle's headlights cut through. The darkness, engine growling. The driver, a grizzled man in desert fatigues, leaned out the window. "Get in." They dove into the truck bed as the tailgate slammed shut. Tires churned the dirt, sending waves of sand behind them. The vehicle lurched forward, chasing dawn through the desert night. Behind them, the enemy pursued, but the storm and darkness swallowed the hunters. Hayes exhaled, fingers still gripping her rifle like a lifeline. Mason, battered but alive, gave her a tired smile. "You made the shot," he said simply. She didn't answer. The mission was far from over. But for now, they were alive. And sometimes that was victory enough. The first light of dawn stretched over the horizon like a pale promise. The desert, once a shrouded mystery under night's blanket, now revealed itself in muted shades of ochre and burnt sienna. Rachel Hayes sat quietly in the back of the extraction truck, the rifle resting beside her as if it were an extension of her own body. Her skin still prickled with the memory of the 3 shots, impossibly long, impossibly precise, that had shattered the enemy's command in a single breathless moment. Her breathing was slow but steady, as if trying to match the rhythm of the waking world outside. Around her, the low murmur of the other operators filled the vehicle's cab, punctuated by the engine's steady rumble, the faint crackle of radio static. Corporal Mason, his leg tightly bandaged, leaned against the side, his eyes scanning the terrain they were leaving behind. The mission's danger was fading, but the weight of its meaning had yet to settle on Hayes' shoulders. Minutes felt like hours until the truck finally rumbled into the safety of the forward operating base. Armed guards snapped to attention, weapons lowered only after recognition. Commanders and intelligence officers waited anxiously, faces taut with concern and relief. Hayes stepped down from the truck, her boots sinking slightly into the dusty ground, every step echoing a silent drumbeat of the mission's success. The debrief room was stark and cold, illuminated by fluorescent lights that did little to chase away the exhaustion pressing on Hayes' eyelids. A map was spread across. The table, enemy positions marked in sharp red, Allied forces in blue. Hayes recounted the operation in precise terms, describing every variable with clinical clarity. The wind was shifting east at 2 clicks, she said, pointing to the line on the map, so I adjusted the scope a half mil to the right. The bullet's flight time was just over 2.5 seconds. Every calculation had to be exact. The room was silent, except for the scribbling of notes and the occasional soft question. No one interrupted. No one doubted. Later, in the quiet solitude of her quarters, Hayes sat by the window, staring out over the desert expanse. The rifle lay on the bed beside her, polished and unassuming now, but still holding the ghosts of the impossible shots. Her thoughts wandered back to the moment she'd taken the first breath, steadied her nerves, and let the bullet fly. The SEAL commander had said no one could make that shot. She had proved otherwise, but triumph came with a silent price. The 3 enemy generals she had killed weren't just targets on a map. They were men with lives, stories, and followers. Their deaths would ripple through the ranks, sparking chaos and retribution. Hayes understood that each bullet fired carried the weight of life and death far beyond the battlefield. She thought of her own comrades, the men and women who had trained her, trusted her, and counted on her to pull off what many deemed impossible. She owed them this success. The hours of painstaking preparation, the long nights crawling through desert sand, the nerve-wracking moment on the ridge, every second had been a thread woven into the mission's fabric. Days later, news filtered back through channels that enemy offensives had stalled. Without their general's leadership, the opposing forces faltered, disorganized and leaderless. Friendly units seized the advantage, pushing forward with renewed vigor. The sniper's bullet had carved a path to victory with precision no artillery. Strike could match. At the award ceremony, Hayes stood quietly as commendations were read aloud. The SEAL commander who had doubted the shot stood beside her now, offering a nod of respect. Yet Hayes deflected praise toward the team, the spotters, the support crews, the analysts who had crunched endless data to make the shot possible. This wasn't a solo act, Hayes told reporters, voice steady but humble. Every victory in the field is a symphony of efforts. The bullet is only as good as the team behind it. Yet even as she spoke, Hayes felt the weight of what that shot meant. It had marked her, not just as a soldier, but as a symbol. A reminder that courage and skill could defy expectations and change the course of history. Months passed, and the story of that night became legend whispered among the ranks. New recruits asked her about the impossible shot, the long range that few dared to believe in. Hayes took those questions seriously, teaching the next generation the same discipline and patience that had saved countless lives. She trained them to understand that every detail mattered, from the grain weight of a bullet to the slight shift of wind hundreds of yards away. That calm steadiness under pressure could be the difference between success and failure, life and death. In quieter moments, Hayes still carried the burden of what it meant to take a life with such precision. A haunting stillness between trigger pulls, the irreversible finality of a single bullet. These were truths she faced with a soldier's resolve, but she also carried the knowledge that her actions had saved lives, shifted the tide of battle, and embodied the ideals she had sworn to uphold. One afternoon, standing on a ridge overlooking a training range, Hayes adjusted the scope on a rifle. Around her, the desert sun beat down on young soldiers eager to learn. She spoke softly but firmly, the memory of that impossible shot lending weight to her words. Legends aren't born from chance, she said. They're forged in the moments you refuse to quit, in the discipline to prepare, in the courage to act when no one else believes you can. The desert wind stirred, carrying the echoes of a night when impossibility was shattered by a single bullet. And in that wind, Rachel Hayes found her legacy, not just as a sniper who made the shot. No one thought possible, but as a soldier who proved that limits were meant to be broken.